This experimental reconstruction of an English hood, also known as a gable hood or a pediment headdress, was made in the style of one in Hans Holbein's portrait of Jane Seymour from 1536 or 37. The experimental reconstruction is worked according to my theory that the iconic English hood is not just a single item, but is built up from separate pieces pinned together on top of each other. Jane Seymour's styling of the twin fall leaves one side folded up on top of the head, while the other side is left hanging down behind her shoulder. This is the more common styling in English hood portraits from the late 1520s and onwards. From the early days of the English hood and until late in the 1520s, both sides of the twin fall would be left to hang down behind the lady's back. The direction of the pile is helping the fall to keep its position of legs far apart, as opposed to giving in to gravity and hanging straight down. In order to get to the lappets, some pins have to come out. They all have to do with the lower section of the edge of pearls. At the bottom, a pin keeps the end of the Aureate at a horizontal position, while at the same time controlling the face-front position of the edge of pearls. When two pins come out at the corner, the lower section of the edge of pearls can be flipped forward. This gives access to the pins involved in the styling of the lappets at the front. In the early days, the lappets would be left to hang down in front of the lady's shoulders. The lappets would at their best be made from cloth of gold in a jacquard weave of diamond shapes. Apart from being an expensive decoration, its purpose seems to be to block the view to anything you're not supposed to see. The majority of the pins connecting the lappets with the other layers is found at the front, where they tie the lappets to the rigid gable shape. What you find under the lappets would be the short panel of the black hood. This is the remains of the much longer panel of the gable-shaped hood's medieval ancestors. The panel is pinned to the next layer. Once the black hood has come off, you can get to 4 pins inside the box bag. When they come out, the box lid can unfold and the black hood can go completely flat for storage and travelling. The Aureate and the layer below it could be removed without taking them apart, as you can get to a headband when you undo the drawstrings at the bottom of the bag. Here you see the headband assembled with a pin. But to show you how the two layers interact, I choose to remove them one by one. And now it's just a matter of pulling out all the pins before the Aureate can come off. Only 2 thin brass wires support the front section of the Aureate, and as they bend at the touch, the Aureate would easily go flat for storage or travelling. Everything left now would be the wired frame and the items attached to it. Once the headband is undone, the wired frame with its edge of pearls and the frontlet will come off. It takes a bit more unpinning to do before the wired frame can be laid out flat. First, I take out the pins connecting the frontlet to the frame at the sides of the face. Then I remove the pins holding the frontlet at the front, as they are also in control of the angle of the gable shape centre front. Then there is the pinning holding the top pieces of the edge of pearls centre front. And now the frame can be laid out flat like the rest of the English hood. The materials used are white linen, preferably as fine as you can come by, white silk taffeta, thread to match, cloth of gold in a jacquard weave of diamond shapes, golden silk taffeta with black stripes represented by a black pen, we have black velvet, but as that is a nightmare for the camera, we're using green velvet instead for showing the details. The black silk taffeta is also replaced with green to show the tailoring. Thread to match. Pearls and goldsmith's work or something else to look the part. Linen interlining for support. Bias tape. Fine brass wire and heavier brass wire. Drawstring. And 2 sheets of pasted rags as interlining material for the rigid parts. To make a sheet of pasted rags, you need 4 pieces of worn out white bed linen, a rectangular placemat with a plain surface, a paintbrush, paste of wheat flour and cold water 1:1, and a cake roller. You also need some other tools for making it: a pair of scissors, a scalpel or a very sharp Stanley knife, a metal ruler, a cutting board, nippers, a lot of pins, needles, and a thimble. When you make the pasted rags, you might want a layer of plastic or a newspaper under the placemat to protect your table. The 4 pieces of rags have been cut to match the size of the placemat, and they should be damp in order to absorb the paste. When you take them out one by one, you do a whiplash on all 4 sides to straighten them. Place the first layer carefully stretched out directly on the placemat. Paint over the fabric with flour paste. And add the next layer of fabric and stretch it out carefully and go over it with a cake roller. Repeat this process until you have 4 layers in all. Leave the sheet of pasted rags to dry in its own time while it stays on the placemat. You should expect it to take about 36 hours, give or take, depending on the humidity of the air. Do not try to speed up the process by putting it anywhere too hot, like out in the sun, as it will start to bake and turn yellow. We start with the gable-shaped frame. Cut the 4 pieces of pasted rags using a metal ruler and a scalpel or a Stanley knife. Bind all edges of the 4 pieces separately with bias tape. Sew on the bias tape with a running stitch, leaving only a dot on one side and a longer stitch on the other. Whip the 4 pieces together to form an elongated rectangle with 3 flexible joints. Now the heavy brass wire goes on the side with the wide part of the bias tape. Whip it on tightly to form 3 rows. Start at the center and shape the corners with nippers as you go along. The whip stitch goes through all layers. Now the frame is strong enough to keep its shape when it is bent at the joints. Put the white silk taffeta on the side facing away from the brass wire. Fold the seam allowance over the edges of the pasted rags and fasten it to the bias tape all the way around using a herringbone stitch which goes into the bias tape. Put the linen to cover the side with the brass wire. Fold in the seam allowance 2 mm too far before the linen is invisibly whipped on to the seam allowance of the silk taffeta 2 mm from the edge. Put a row of fine back stitches through all layers at every joint or gathering of pasted rags to ensure that the fabric clings to the corners when the frame is shaped. The headbands are folded down the middle. All seam allowance is folded in. The edges are whipped together with an invisible whip stitch along the open side and the ends. One end of each headband is whipped to the frame of pasted rags between the markings I and J. Tack all pieces of the frontlet, both the striped silk taffeta ones and the linen ones, to their matching pieces of linen interlining. Fold the seam allowance over all the edges with the herringbone stitch, invisible on the outside. The paired pieces of silk taffeta and linen are invisibly whipped together along all edges. Now sew the finished frontlet pieces onto the silky side of the frame between the markings E and F, 1 cm from the front of the frame of pasted rags. The stitches have to go through all layers of the frame. To make the edge of pearls, you first cover each of the 4 pieces of pasted rags with bias tape. Then tack on the silk taffeta with 1 seam allowance folded over the edge. Hold this seam allowance in place using a herringbone stitch going into the bias tape. Arrange the pearls and goldsmith's work on the string like you would do to form a necklace. Place the string of pearls on top of the taffeta and hold it with pins going over the string. The sewing is done by whipping over the string going through the pasted rags and the silk taffeta. The rest of the silk taffeta is now made to cover the back side of the pasted rags. Fold in the seam allowance and do up the open edges using an invisible whip stitch. The edge of pearls, which is built up from 4 separate pieces, is now whipped onto the front edge of the frame, matching the markings on the pattern. Make sure that the ornamentation is facing the right way. The frame is styled to its gable shape. The 2 top sections of the edge of pearls are joined centre front. The frontlet is pinned to the frame, top centre and at the sides. Once the headband is pinned at the back, the frontlet clings tightly to the lady's forehead. Now we turn to the Aureate, which is built up from 3 separate sections: the front section, the ear section in the middle and the bag. We start with the front section. The linen interlining has been tacked onto the silk taffeta, stopping at the markings C and D either end, and the seam allowance of the silk is turned over the linen interlining with a herringbone stitch. Cut 2 pieces of fine brass wire. They should each of them be 6 centimeters longer than the linen interlining, so they will reach the markings E and F. The 2 wires are whipped on, not too tightly, to the seam allowance of the silk taffeta very close to the edge. Fold the seam allowance of the linen and whip it on to the edge of the silk taffeta from the markings A and B at the centre to the markings C and D. Fold up the ends of the unsupported silk taffeta along the dotted line between the markings E and F and fold in the seam allowance. Place the brass wire between the 2 layers of seam allowance and whip the edges together with an invisible whip stitch. The wire is held in place in a narrow casing right next to the edge. The casing is created with a tiny running stitch. Turn up the seam allowance of the linen between the markings C and D and whip the linen to the silk taffeta. Extend the narrow wire casing by means of a running stitch right next to the wire all the way from the markings C and D on either end and to the markings A and B at the centre. Now we move on to the ear section. The linen interlining is tacked on to the silk taffeta and the seam allowance is folded over the edge of the interlining with a herringbone stitch. Fold in the seam allowance of the linen and sew the linen to the seam allowance of the silk taffeta with a tiny running stitch. Here you see the Aureate turned inside out. The front of the bag is turned over twice and hemmed. Whip over the seam allowance at the top and sew the 2 sides together. The seam allowance at the bottom is folded over twice between the markings E and G and hemmed to form a casing for the drawstrings. Leave an opening between the markings F when you close the ends. The 2 drawstrings are fastened right and left respectively, which provides a firm gathering when the strings are pulled. Gather the top very tightly between the markings E and H by means of a running stitch. The 3 sections of the Aureate are whipped together. The bag goes to the ear section and the ear section goes to the front section. The front of the Aureate is pinned to the frame so tightly that they look like one piece. It takes a long time and a lot of pins, but the 2 pieces could be assembled in advance. The black hood is built up from 3 sections: the box bag, the panel and the fall. The 2 sides are worked separately until they are eventually joined top and bottom. We start with the box bag consisting of the box lid and the box sides. The pasted rags of the sides of the box bag are cut halfway through along the dotted line between the markings C and G. Use a scalpel or a very sharp Stanley knife and a metal ruler. This gives the flexibility wanted to form the diamond shape of the box bag. Bind all edges with bias tape. It's very important that the wider part of the bias tape is facing away from the incision. Place the velvet on the pasted rags on the side with the incision and fold the seam allowance over the edges. The velvet is secured to the bias tape with a herringbone stitch. Fold in all seam allowance of the silk taffeta and whip it on to the velvet seam allowance close to the edge. For the box lid, you bind the edges of the triangles of pasted rags and place them on the wrong side of the velvet according to the markings on the pattern. Whip them tightly onto the velvet. Now the triangles leave a very clear imprint on the right side of the fabric. Fold in the seam allowance using a herringbone stitch. Fold in the seam allowance of the silk taffeta and whip it onto the velvet seam allowance close to the edge. Do a row of tiny running stitches right next to the triangles to keep the silk taffeta stretched out over the pasted rags. Lid and sides are whipped together. For the panel, you tack the linen interlining to the silk taffeta, the part which will be facing outwards. Fold the seam allowance over the edges of the interlining and secure it with a herringbone stitch, which will be invisible on the outside. Tack on the lining, also silk taffeta, and fold in the seam allowance, and then you join the layers with an invisible running stitch along all edges. The panel is pinned to the box side, lining against lining, and whipped on between the markings B and D. All parts of the fall are tacked to their matching pieces of linen interlining. All seam allowance is folded over the edges and hemmed with a herringbone stitch, which should be invisible on the outside. The two narrow parts of velvet and taffeta respectively are joined between the markings O and P. Use a whip stitch for this. To avoid unwanted friction between the velvet and the taffeta, the pieces are pinned together wrong side against wrong side below the seam allowance. Join the two sides of the fall along the edges using an invisible whip stitch. The fall is pinned to the box bag side, right side against right side, between the markings C and E, and it is whipped on. The two sides of the black hood are now invisibly whipped together, lining against lining, between the markings E and L at the bottom and between the markings A and I at the top. The bag is shaped to form a diamond by means of 4 pins. At the front, the panel is pinned to the Aureate. It does not have to come out all the way to the very front of the Aureate. The two parts of the lappets are tacked to the matching pieces of linen interlining, and all the seam allowance is folded over the edges with a herringbone stitch, which should be invisible on the outside. The taffeta part and the part in a jacquard weave are invisibly whipped together, wrong side against wrong side, to form a tube. The tube is laid out flat in the way that the two seams are not on top of each other, and holding that position, the ends are done with a whip stitch. The lappets are placed with the cloth of gold facing forward. At the top, the lappets must come out to align with the front of the Aureate, but at the sides they should be pulled back 2 millimeters to make room for the lower parts of the edge of pearls. The ends of the lappets are secured to the top of the hood. Now the corners of the edge of pearls are pinned, and a single pin holds the ends of the Aureate styled to a horizontal position. Before being flipped up, one side of the twin fold is given a pleat with a pin, and with another 2 pins securing the end of the fold, the dressing is completed.